The history of Nigeria. Ancient era, the cradle of African civilization. In West Africa, where the Niger River meets the Atlantic, lies a nation of extraordinary complexity and vitality. Nigeria, home to over 220 million people, Africa's most populous nation and largest economy, a land of over 250 ethnic groups speaking more than 500 languages. From ancient terracotta sculptures that rivaled classical Greece to powerful medieval empires that traded across the Sahara, from the trauma of the transatlantic slave trade to the struggle for independence and democracy, Nigeria's story is central to understanding Africa's past, present, and future. This is a nation that didn't exist before 1914, created by British colonial administrators who drew lines on a map, yet built on foundations of civilizations thousands of years old. Our journey begins not in the colonial period that gave Nigeria its name and borders, but in the deep past, when sophisticated societies flourished in the forests, savannas, and river valleys of West Africa. Prehistoric Nigeria, 12,000 BCE, 500 BCE. The land now called Nigeria has been inhabited for millennia. Archaeological evidence shows human settlement dating back at least 12,000 years. As the Sahara dried around 3000 BCE, people migrated south into the region, bringing agriculture, metalworking, and complex social organization. The Jos Plateau in central Nigeria shows evidence of ironworking dating to at least 500 BCE, among the earliest in sub-Saharan Africa. The Nok culture, which flourished from around 1000 BCE to 300 CE, produced remarkable terracotta sculptures, human and animal figures of great artistic sophistication. These aren't primitive artifacts but works of art displaying technical mastery and aesthetic refinement that challenge Western assumptions about African civilization. The Nok developed iron tools, practiced agriculture, and lived in organized communities. Their art suggests complex religious beliefs and social hierarchies. Why the Nok culture declined remains mysterious, but their artistic traditions influenced later Nigerian cultures. The Nok culture and early settlements, 1000 BCE, 200 CE. The Nok weren't alone. Across the region that would become Nigeria, diverse peoples developed distinct cultures adapted to their environments. In the forests of the south, communities practiced agriculture, yams, palm oil, kola nuts, and developed sophisticated political systems. Along the coast, fishing communities traded with inland peoples. In the savanna regions of the north, pastoralists herded cattle while farmers grew millet and sorghum. Trade routes connected these regions, exchanging goods, ideas, and people. Salt from the Sahara, kola nuts from the forest, iron tools from metalworking centers. These items moved along trading networks that predated European contact by centuries. Language groups were establishing themselves. The Bantu expansion, one of human history's great migrations, brought Bantu-speaking peoples into southeastern Nigeria. The Niger-Congo language family diversified into the hundreds of languages spoken in Nigeria today: Yoruba, Igbo, Hausa, Fulani, Efik, Ijaw, Tiv, and countless others. These weren't isolated villages but interconnected societies with trade, warfare, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. The foundations of Nigerian civilization were being laid, foundations often ignored or dismissed by colonial-era narratives that portrayed pre-colonial Africa as primitive and static. The rise of urbanization, 200 CE, 1000 CE. By the first millennium CE, urban centers were emerging. At Igbo-Ukwu in southeastern Nigeria, archaeological excavations revealed a sophisticated bronze-working culture from the 9th century CE. The bronzes, ceremonial vessels, ornaments, ritual objects, display technical excellence and artistic vision. The lost wax casting technique used by Igbo-Ukwu artisans was as advanced as any in the world. These weren't isolated achievements. Igbo-Ukwu traded with distant regions. Glass beads from Venice or India found at the site prove long-distance connections. This was a society with specialized craftsmen, social hierarchies, and the wealth to support elaborate artistic production. Around the same time, urban centers were developing across the region. Ife, in southwestern Nigeria, emerged as the spiritual and political center of Yoruba civilization. Ife's artists created bronze and terracotta sculptures of astounding realism and beauty. The naturalistic bronze heads from Ife, created around the 12th to 15th centuries, rank among humanity's great artistic achievements. Ife wasn't just an artistic center, it was a sacred city. Yoruba tradition identifies Ife as the place where the gods created the world and humanity. The Uni of Ife, the city's spiritual and political leader, was revered across Yorubaland. Even today, Yoruba kings trace their legitimacy to Ife. Act 2. Medieval period, empires, kingdoms, and cultures. The Kanem-Bornu Empire, 700 CE, 1600 CE. In northeastern Nigeria, near Lake Chad, the Kanem-Bornu Empire rose to prominence. Founded around the 9th century CE, it became one of Africa's longest-lasting empires, enduring for nearly a millennium. Kanem-Bornu controlled trans-Saharan trade routes connecting West Africa to North Africa and the Mediterranean. Gold, ivory, and enslaved people moved north, salt, horses, and manufactured goods moved south. This trade brought wealth and Islamic influence. Islam arrived in Kanem-Bornu around the 11th century when the ruling dynasty converted. Islamic scholarship flourished. Quranic schools attracted students from across the region. Arabic became the language of learning and administration, though traditional beliefs persisted alongside Islam. The empire's capital shifted from Kanem to Bornu, in modern Nigeria, around the 14th century due to internal conflicts. Under Mai Idris Aluma in the late 16th century, Bornu reached its peak, controlling vast territories, maintaining a professional army equipped with firearms imported from North Africa, and promoting Islamic law while tolerating local customs. Kanem-Bornu demonstrated that African states could be powerful, sophisticated, and enduring. It was contemporary with medieval European kingdoms and in many ways more advanced, more tolerant, more commercially developed, and more stable. The Hausa city-states, 1000 CE, 1800 CE. 3. In northern Nigeria, the Hausa people developed a unique political system, not a unified empire but a collection of independent city-states. According to the Bayajidda legend, 7 Hausa city-states were founded by the sons of a legendary hero, Kano, Katsina, Zoria, Gobir, Reno, Dora, and Bayram, the Hausa Bakwai, or Hausa 7. These city-states were commercial and manufacturing centers. Kano became particularly prominent, famous for textile production, leatherwork, and metalworking. Kano's city walls, built in the 14th century, enclosed one of West Africa's largest urban centers. The Kermi market in Kano was a major trading hub where goods from across the Sahara and West Africa were exchanged. The Hausa states competed and cooperated. They shared language, culture, and Islamic religion. Islam had spread through Hausaland by the 14th century, but remained politically independent. This competitive dynamic drove innovation and commercial development. Hausa merchants, the Fatake, traded across West Africa, establishing Hausa communities in distant cities. They became known for literacy, commercial acumen, and Islamic learning. Hausa became a lingua franca across West Africa, facilitating trade and cultural exchange. The Hausa states also engaged in continuous warfare. Kano and Katsina competed for commercial dominance. Gobir fought against expanding neighbors. This militarization would eventually make them vulnerable to a different kind of threat, religious revolution from within. The Yoruba kingdoms, 1000 CE, 1800 CE. In southwestern Nigeria, Yoruba civilization flourished in numerous kingdoms, acknowledging Ife as their spiritual source. The most powerful was Oyo, which became a formidable empire from the 17th century onward. The Oyo Empire controlled territories stretching from the forests to the savannah. Its power rested on cavalry. Horses couldn't survive in the tsetse-fly-infested forest, giving savannah kingdoms military advantage. Oyo's Alafin, king, commanded a sophisticated political system with checks on royal power, a council of kingmakers who could require the Alafin to commit ritual suicide if he governed poorly. Oyo participated in the transatlantic slave trade, raiding neighboring territories and selling captives to European traders on the coast. This trade brought firearms and wealth, but also instability and moral corruption. The Oyo Empire's participation in the slave trade would eventually contribute to its decline. Benin, though technically not Yoruba but closely related Edo people, deserves mention. The Kingdom of Benin, centered in modern-day Benin City, was renowned for its bronze plaques and sculptures, artistic masterpieces that European visitors compared to Renaissance art. Benin was a powerful, centralized state with elaborate court rituals and sophisticated political organization. When British forces invaded Benin in 1897, they looted thousands of bronze artworks, the famous Benin bronzes now displayed in museums worldwide. These stolen artifacts became symbols of colonial plunder and ongoing calls for repatriation. Igbo societies and decentralized governance, 1000 CE, 1800 CE. While empires and kingdoms dominated the northern and western regions, southeastern Nigeria developed a different political model. The Igbo people, numbering millions, largely eschewed centralized kingdoms in favor of decentralized, democratic systems. Igbo society was organized into autonomous villages and town confederations. Leadership came through achievement, age grades, title societies, and councils of elders rather than hereditary monarchy. This republican tradition emphasized individual achievement, community consensus, and checks on power. The Igbo saying Igbo enwe ease, the Igbo have no kings, expresses this political philosophy, though some Igbo communities did have traditional rulers. The decentralized system made Igbo society resilient but also vulnerable to external threats from more militarized neighbors. Igbo culture valued commerce and craftsmanship. The Aro people, an Igbo subgroup, controlled extensive trading networks using the Arachukwu oracle as both religious center and commercial institution. They traded across southeastern Nigeria and beyond, including, tragically, in enslaved people. The Atlantic slave trade. Portuguese ships reached the West African coast in the 15th century, initiating contact that would devastate Africa for 4 centuries. The transatlantic slave trade became the defining horror of this era. European demand for labor in American plantations created insatiable demand for enslaved Africans. African coastal kingdoms and merchants became intermediaries, trading captives for firearms, alcohol, and manufactured goods. The consequences were catastrophic. An estimated 3.5 million people were shipped from what is now Nigeria, particularly from the Niger Delta and southeastern regions. The human cost is incalculable. Families destroyed. Communities depopulated. Warfare intensified as kingdoms raided for captives. The trade in human beings corrupted societies and economies. The Middle Passage, the voyage across the Atlantic, was hell. Enslaved people were packed into ships' holds in unimaginable conditions. Perhaps 15 to 20% died during the voyage. Survivors faced lives of brutal slavery in the Americas. The slave trade's effects on Nigerian societies were profound. It militarized societies, elevated warrior classes, undermined traditional values, introduced firearms that intensified warfare, and drained populations of productive adults. When the British finally suppressed the slave trade in the 19th century, the damage had been done. Yet African agency must be recognized. Africans weren't passive victims. Some resisted, some collaborated, some profited. The slave trade was a complex system involving European demand, African supply, and American consumption. But ultimate responsibility lies with those who created the demand and the system, European and American slave traders and plantation owners. The Sokoto Caliphate. In the early 19th century, religious revolution transformed northern Nigeria. Usman Dan Fodio, a Fulani Islamic scholar, launched a jihad against the Hausa kingdoms, which he accused of mixing Islam with traditional practices and ruling unjustly. Beginning in 1804, Dan Fodio's movement swept across Hausaland. Within a few years, the Hausa city-states had fallen. The Sokoto Caliphate was established, one of the largest states in Africa, stretching across much of northern Nigeria and beyond. The Caliphate implemented Sharia law, promoted Islamic education, and created a sophisticated administrative system. Sokoto became a center of Islamic learning, attracting scholars from across West Africa. The Caliphate's leaders, the Sultan of Sokoto and regional emirs, combined political and religious authority. But the Caliphate also practiced slavery on a massive scale. While the transatlantic slave trade was ending, internal slavery intensified. The Caliphate raided non-Muslim areas, particularly the Middle Belt, capturing people for enslavement. At its peak, the Sokoto Caliphate may have contained more enslaved people than existed in the American South. This internal slave system would become a justification for British colonization, though British motives were primarily economic and strategic, not humanitarian. Act 3. Early Modern Era, Colonialism and Resistance. British penetration, 1850s, 1900. British interest in Nigeria grew throughout the 19th century. After abolishing the slave trade in 1807, Britain established a naval squadron to suppress the trade, though enforcement was inconsistent. British missionaries and explorers penetrated inland, seeking to civilize and Christianize. British commercial interests focused on legitimate trade, palm oil, particularly, which was essential for industrial lubricants and soap. The Royal Niger Company, chartered in 1886, established British commercial dominance in the Niger River region, signing treaties with local rulers that often ceded sovereignty in exchange for protection or trade goods. These treaties were frequently obtained through deception, coercion, or misunderstanding. Local rulers believed they were signing trade agreements. The British claimed they were ceding sovereignty. This pattern of fraudulent treaties would become the legal fiction justifying colonial rule. Military expeditions enforced British will. The destruction of Benin in 1897 was particularly brutal. British forces burned the city, killed defenders, and looted artwork and treasures. It was punishment for Benin's resistance to British control and a warning to other kingdoms. The conquest and creation of Nigeria, 1900 to 1914. In 1900, the British government took direct control from the Royal Niger Company, establishing the protectorates of northern and southern Nigeria. Over the next few years, British forces conquered territories that resisted. The conquest of the Sokoto Caliphate required military force. At the Battle of Burmi in 1903, British forces defeated the last resistance from Caliph Atahiru I, who died fighting rather than submit. The Sokoto Caliphate had fallen after nearly a century of existence. British conquest of southeastern Nigeria was complicated by decentralized Igbo societies. There were no kings to defeat or treaties to sign. The British fought village by village, imposing control through punitive expeditions and establishing warrant chiefs, appointed leaders who lacked traditional legitimacy but served British administrative needs. In 1914, Lord Frederick Lugard, the British colonial administrator, amalgamated the northern and southern protectorates, creating the Colony and Protectorate of Nigeria. The name came from the Niger River. This administrative convenience created a country containing hundreds of distinct ethnic groups with different languages, religions, and political systems. Nigeria was never meant to be a unified nation. It was a colonial administrative unit designed to facilitate British rule and economic exploitation. The borders ignored ethnic, linguistic, and cultural realities. Bitter fruits of this arbitrary creation would become apparent after independence. Colonial governance, indirect rule, 1914 to 1945. The British governed Nigeria through indirect rule, using traditional authorities as intermediaries. In the north, this worked reasonably well. The Sokoto Caliphate's emirate system provided ready-made administrative structures. Emirs collected taxes, maintained order, and enforced British policies while retaining considerable local autonomy. In the southwest, Yoruba monarchies served similar functions, though with more British interference. But in the southeast, indirect rule was a disaster. The British created warrant chiefs with no traditional legitimacy. These appointed chiefs were often corrupt, arbitrary, and deeply resented. In 1929, Igbo women in southeastern Nigeria launched the Women's War, Ogu Umunwani, protesting warrant chiefs, taxation, and British policies. Thousands of women demonstrated at native courts and British administrative centres. When British authorities responded with force, killing over 50 women, it became an international scandal. The Women's War revealed colonial rule's fragility and the courage of ordinary people resisting oppression. It forced some reforms, though fundamental injustices remained. Colonial economic policy prioritized extraction. Nigeria's resources, palm oil, cocoa, peanuts, cotton, tin, coal, were exported to Britain. Infrastructure, railways, ports, roads, was built to facilitate extraction, not Nigerian development. Education was limited and designed to produce clerks and intermediaries, not independent thinkers or leaders. Different regions developed differently. The North remained largely agricultural and isolated from Western education due to Islamic authorities' resistance. The South embraced missionary education, creating an educated class that would later challenge colonial rule. This uneven development created regional inequalities persisting today. The rise of Nigerian nationalism, 1920s to 1950s. World War I and II profoundly affected Nigerian nationalism. Nigerian soldiers fought for Britain in both wars, traveling beyond Africa and questioning why they fought for freedom abroad while denied it at home. Educated Nigerians, teachers, lawyers, journalists, civil servants, began demanding political rights. Herbert Macaulay, often called the father of Nigerian nationalism, founded the Nigerian National Democratic Party in 1923, agitating for representation and self-government. Nnamdi Azikiwe, an Igbo journalist educated in America, used newspapers to advocate for independence. His charisma and Pan-Africanist vision inspired many. Obafemi Awolowo, a Yoruba lawyer, organized the Yoruba people politically while articulating a vision of federalism for Nigeria's diverse peoples. In the north, Ahmadu Bello, the Sardauna of Sokoto, emerged as the leading figure, promoting northern interests within Nigeria while maintaining Islamic values and traditional structures. These leaders represented different regions, ethnic groups, and visions for Nigeria's future. Their inability to forge unified national vision would plague independent Nigeria. After World War II, British colonial power was exhausted. Across Africa and Asia, independence movements accelerated. Britain recognized that direct colonial rule was no longer sustainable or profitable. The question wasn't whether Nigeria would be independent, but when and how. The path to independence, 1945 to 1960. The 1950s saw rapid political development. Constitutional conferences negotiated the terms of self-government. Regionalism dominated. Northern, Western, and Eastern regions each had distinct political parties, ethnic bases, and interests. The Northern People's Congress, NPC, represented Hausa Fulani interests. The Action Group represented Yoruba interests. The National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons, NCNC, initially aspired to be national but became increasingly identified with Igbo interests. Political competition took on ethnic dimensions. Parties mobilized supporters along ethnic lines. Fears of domination by other ethnic groups intensified. The North, with over half Nigeria's population, worried that unification would mean Southern domination economically and culturally. The South worried about Northern numerical dominance politically. Regional governments were granted internal self-governance in 1957. On October 1, 1960, Nigeria became independent. Tafawa Balewa, a Northerner, became Prime Minister. Nnamdi Azikiwe became Governor-General, later President when Nigeria became a republic in 1963. The celebrations were joyous. The green-white-green flag was raised. Nigeria was free. But beneath the celebration lay unresolved tensions, ethnic rivalries, regional inequalities, and constitutional arrangements that satisfied nobody fully. The stage was set for tragedy. Modern era, independence, civil war, and oil. The First Republic, 1960 to 1966. Independent Nigeria's early years were troubled. Politics became increasingly corrupt and violent. Elections were rigged. Political opponents were intimidated. The 1964 federal elections were so fraudulent that they nearly tore the country apart. The census became a political battlefield. Regional allocation of resources and political representation depended on population counts. The 1962-63 census produced absurd results, with regions inflating figures. Trust between regions collapsed. In the Western region, internal splits in the Action Group led to political crisis. The federal government intervened, imprisoning opposition leader Obafemi Awolowo on dubious treason charges. The Western region descended into chaos, thuggery, arson, electoral fraud. Operation Weti, political violence involving attacking opponents with petrol, terrorized the region. By 1966, Nigeria's civilian government had lost legitimacy. The military, watching in disgust, decided to act. The first military coup, 1966. On January 15, 1966, young army officers staged a coup. They killed senior military officers and politicians, including Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa and the Sardona of Sokoto, Ahmadu Bello. The coup was portrayed as ending corruption, but its ethnic dimensions were obvious. The coup plotters were mostly Igbo, and most victims were northern and western leaders. Major General Johnson Agui Ironsi, an Igbo, became head of state. His decree unifying Nigeria's civil service and abolishing federal structure alarmed northerners, who saw it as Igbo domination. In July 1966, northern officers staged a counter-coup, killing Igbo officers including Ironsi. Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon, a northerner, became head of state. Anti-Igbo pogroms erupted in northern Nigeria. Thousands of Igbo were murdered. Perhaps 1 million Igbo fled south to the eastern region. The eastern region's military governor, Colonel Odumegwu Ojukwu, refused to recognize Gowon's authority. Negotiations failed. On May 30, 1967, Ojukwu declared the eastern region's independence as the Republic of Biafra. The Nigerian Civil War, the Biafran War, 1967 to 1970. The Nigerian Civil War began in July 1967. It would last 3 years and kill perhaps 1 to 3 million people, mostly Igbo civilians who died from starvation. Initially, Biafran forces advanced, but Nigeria's federal forces, larger and better supplied, pushed them back. The federal government blockaded Biafra, preventing food imports. As war continued, starvation became the main killer. Images of starving Biafran children shocked the world. International response was complex. Britain and the Soviet Union supported the federal government. France and some African nations quietly supported Biafra. Most nations remained neutral, accepting Nigeria's territorial integrity. Relief agencies tried to provide aid, but federal authorities restricted access. Biafra's surrender came in January 1970. Ojukwu fled. The federal government proclaimed no victor, no vanquished and promised reconciliation. To Gowon's credit, there was no post-war genocide. Igbo were reintegrated, though not without discrimination and loss. The war's legacy haunts Nigeria. Igbo lost property, savings, and opportunities. The trauma persists in collective memory. Secessionist sentiment, though dormant, never entirely disappeared. The war also centralized power. States were created to weaken regional power bases. Oil revenue concentrated federal authority. The oil boom, 1970s. The 1970s brought oil wealth. Nigeria joined OPEC in 1971. The 1973 oil crisis quadrupled prices. Petrodollars flooded Nigeria. Oil revenue went from a few $100 million to billions annually. The oil boom transformed Nigeria, and not always for the better. The government launched ambitious projects, steel mills, refineries, new capital at Abuja. But corruption exploded. Military officials and civilian contractors looted treasury. The saying emerged: the Nigerian problem is the problem of plenty. Agriculture, once Nigeria's economic base, was neglected. Nigeria, which had exported palm oil, groundnuts, and cocoa, began importing food. The Dutch disease, where resource wealth crowds out other productive sectors, set in. The Gowon government, initially reformist, became complacent and corrupt. In 1975, while Gowon attended an OAU summit, military officers led by Brigadier Murtala Mohammed overthrew him. Murtala promised anti-corruption measures and transition to civilian rule. He fired corrupt officials and began constitutional reform. But in February 1976, Murtala was assassinated in a failed coup attempt. His chief of staff, Olusegun Obasanjo, succeeded him and continued the transition program. The Second Republic, 1979 to 1983. In 1979, Nigeria returned to civilian rule under a new constitution modeled on America's presidential system. Shehu Shagari of the National Party of Nigeria, NPN, won the presidency in a controversial election. The Second Republic repeated the First Republic's mistakes. Politics became ethnic and regional. Corruption worsened. Economic management was disastrous. Despite oil wealth, Nigeria borrowed heavily. When oil prices fell in the early 1980s, Nigeria faced economic crisis. The 1983 elections were massively rigged. The NPN claimed improbable victories. Public disgust was widespread. On New Year's Eve 1983, the military struck again. Major General Muhammadu Buhari overthrew Shagari's government. Military rule, Buhari and Babangida. 1983 Buhari's regime was authoritarian but disciplined. He launched the war against indiscipline, campaigns promoting punctuality, cleanliness, and order. He jailed corrupt politicians. But his government was repressive, detaining journalists, restricting civil liberties. In 1985, Buhari's chief of army staff, Ibrahim Babangida, overthrew him. Babangida was clever, manipulative, and deeply corrupt. He promised transition to democracy but kept postponing it. He annulled elections when results didn't favor him. He played ethnic and religious divisions against each other. Babangida introduced structural adjustment programs, SAP, at IMF insistence, devaluing currency, removing subsidies, privatizing state enterprises. SAP caused widespread hardship. Living standards plummeted. Universities and hospitals decayed. Nigerians coined the term Babangida, father who deceives. The June 12, 1993, presidential election was Nigeria's freest and fairest. Moshood Abiola, a Yoruba Muslim businessman, won decisively, bridging ethnic and religious divides. But Babangida annulled the election, claiming irregularities. The annulment triggered protests and riots. Babangida resigned, installing an interim government. In November 1993, General Sani Abacha seized power. The Abacha dictatorship, 1993 to 1998. Abacha's regime was Nigeria's darkest period since the Civil War. It was brutal, kleptocratic, and paranoid. Abacha imprisoned Abiola for declaring himself president. He executed environmental activist Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 other Ogoni leaders after a sham trial, punishment for protesting oil pollution in the Niger Delta. Abacha looted billions. Estimates range from $3 to $5 billion stolen and hidden in foreign banks. He murdered opponents, including Abiola's wife Kudirat, gunned down in Lagos. He rigged a transition process to perpetuate his rule. Nigeria became an international pariah. The Commonwealth suspended Nigeria. Sanctions were threatened. But Abacha's oil kept flowing. Western nations condemned while continuing to buy Nigerian oil. In June 1998, Abacha died suddenly, officially of a heart attack, though rumors of poisoning persist. Abiola died a month later in suspicious circumstances while meeting American officials. Nigeria was released from nightmare, but at tremendous cost. Return to democracy, 1999, present. Next, General Abdulsalami Abubakar, who succeeded Abacha, organized rapid transition to civilian rule. In 1999, Olusegun Obasanjo, a former military ruler now running as civilian, won the presidency. The Fourth Republic began with hope but faced enormous challenges. Democratic institutions were weak. Corruption was endemic. Infrastructure had decayed. Ethnic and religious tensions remained high. The Niger Delta, source of Nigeria's oil wealth, became increasingly restless. The Ogoni and other Niger Delta peoples suffered environmental devastation from oil extraction while seeing little benefit. Militant groups emerged, kidnapping oil workers and attacking pipelines, demanding resource control and environmental cleanup. In the north, Boko Haram, an extremist Islamist insurgency, emerged around 2002, becoming violently active by 2009. The group seeks to impose strict Islamic law and opposes Western education. Boko Haram means Western education is forbidden. Its insurgency has killed tens of thousands and displaced millions in northeastern Nigeria. Obasanjo served 2 terms, 1999 to 2007. He fought corruption inconsistently, pursuing opponents while tolerating allies' corruption. He stabilized democracy but couldn't resist trying to extend his tenure beyond constitutional limits. The National Assembly blocked his 3rd-term bid. Umaru Musa Yar'Adua succeeded Obasanjo but was frequently ill. When he died in 2010, Vice President Goodluck Jonathan, a Southern Christian, became president. His 2015 election defeat to Muhammadu Buhari marked Nigeria's first democratic transfer of power between parties, a historic milestone. Buhari, the former military ruler now elected democratically, promised to fight corruption and Boko Haram. His record has been mixed, some anti-corruption efforts, some improvement in security, but also economic challenges, growing debt, and continued insecurity. In 2023, Bola Tinubu won a controversial election marked by irregularities and low turnout. Nigeria's democracy persists but remains fragile. Ending: Nigeria's complex present and future. The Nigerian identity. What does it mean to be Nigerian? This question haunts Africa's most populous nation. Nigeria is not a natural unit. It's a colonial creation containing hundreds of ethnic groups with different languages, religions, and histories. Yet Nigerian identity exists. It's forged through shared experience, colonial oppression, civil war trauma, military rule, and democratic struggle. It's expressed through culture, Nollywood films, Afrobeats music, jollof rice debates, and football passion. It's embodied in diaspora success. Nigerians excel globally in literature, business, medicine, and technology. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's novels capture Nigerian complexity. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart remains essential reading on colonialism's impact. Fela Kuti's Afrobeat music combined infectious rhythms with political critique. Wizkid and Burna Boy bring Nigerian sounds to global audiences. Yet ethnic and religious divisions persist. The North-South divide, roughly separating the predominantly Muslim North from the largely Christian South, shapes politics and creates tension. Ethnic competition for resources and recognition continues. These divisions are exploited by politicians and exacerbated by inequality. Exploited by politicians and exacerbated by inequality. The Oil Curse 10. Oil has been both blessing and curse. It generates over 90% of export earnings and most government revenue. It made Nigeria Africa's largest economy. But it also caused Dutch disease, corruption, environmental devastation, and complacency. The Niger Delta, where oil is extracted, suffers environmental catastrophe, oil spills, gas flaring, water pollution. Communities that should be wealthy from oil beneath their feet remain poor, their environment destroyed, their livelihoods ruined. Nigeria imports refined petroleum despite being a major oil producer. Its refineries are dysfunctional due to corruption and mismanagement. Fuel subsidies cost billions annually and benefit smugglers and corrupt officials more than ordinary Nigerians. Diversification has been promised for decades but rarely seriously pursued. When oil prices drop, Nigeria suffers. Economic planning remains short-term, focused on sharing oil revenue rather than building sustainable, diversified economy. The oil curve. Oil has been both blessing and curse. It generates over 90% of export earnings and most government revenue. It made Nigeria Africa's largest economy. But it also caused Dutch disease, corruption, environmental devastation, and complacency. The Niger Delta, where oil is extracted, suffers environmental catastrophe, oil spills, gas flaring, water pollution. Communities that should be wealthy from oil beneath their feet remain poor, their environment destroyed, their livelihoods ruined. Nigeria imports refined petroleum despite being a major oil producer. Its refineries are dysfunctional due to corruption and mismanagement. Fuel subsidies cost billions annually and benefit smugglers and corrupt officials more than ordinary Nigerians. Diversification has been promised for decades but rarely seriously pursued. When oil prices drop, Nigeria suffers. Economic planning remains short-term, focused on sharing oil revenue rather than building sustainable, diversified economy. Contemporary challenges. Nigeria faces formidable challenges. Insecurity plagues many regions. Boko Haram in the northeast, banditry in the northwest, farmer-herder conflicts in the Middle Belt, separatist agitation in the southeast, and Niger Delta militancy. The state's inability to provide security erodes legitimacy. Corruption remains endemic despite anti-corruption rhetoric. Transparency International consistently ranks Nigeria among the world's most corrupt nations. Corruption diverts resources from education, healthcare, and infrastructure to private pockets. Infrastructure deficit is staggering. Power supply is unreliable. Nigerians spend fortunes on generators. Roads are death traps. Railways are underdeveloped. Internet access is limited. These deficits constrain economic development. Education and healthcare systems are in crisis. Brain drain accelerates as talented Nigerians emigrate seeking opportunities abroad. Japa, slang for emigrating, has become a national phenomenon as young Nigerians flee limited opportunities, insecurity, and poor governance. Youth unemployment exceeds 40%. Population growth. Nigeria may have 400 million people by 2050, intensifies pressure on resources and opportunities. Demographic dividend could become demographic disaster without job creation and education investment. Nigerian resilience and potential. Yet Nigeria persists. Despite challenges, Nigerians display remarkable resilience, creativity. Subscribe to Timelines of Nations for weekly videos exploring the ancient to modern history of countries around the world.